ready to. We'll go ahead and get ready to get started. So today's call is around creating high quality assessments. And if you've been following the network, then you probably already know who I am, Shauna Stefanchik. I'm the president and founder of Step Up Consulting. And I'm hopeful today that this is a really pressing topic of how do we create high quality assessments. So I'm hopeful that this will be beneficial to you. So the goal of today's call is going to be to determine why high quality assessments are essential, to be able to review the current standard and assessment gap that makes creating assessments difficult. And then I want to present to you steps you could follow to create high quality assessments on your own. And I'm going to, Seth, I'm going to go ahead and make you a co-host if you wouldn't mind checking if anybody else hops into the call. So first we have this question, curriculum or assessment. This is always interesting to do with your teachers, to discuss which one do you think comes first and to hear where they end on that. Because in some ways it is like the chicken or the egg. We have to know what we're going to teach, but we also need to assess it. And the philosophy of our company is we feel like there's a lot of power in backward design. So we remember the work from the 90s of Understanding by Design by Grant Wiggins and Jay McTighe, that we would argue, even though it's a chicken or egg conversation, that assessment should come first, because when teachers are really clear on what those assessments should look like and sound like, they can backward design their instruction to align and to be as rigorous as needed. So why is backward design important? It clarifies the standard, it clarifies the rigor, it clarifies the question type, which can be very difficult for students, and therefore it helps clarify instruction. So we would say start with assessment so you could backward design and align those things for students. Then there's the other why of high quality assessments are so essential for schools to be thinking about right now. We know with the shift to the new priority standards that by 2024, 80 to 90% of all of our MAP and EOC scores are around those priority standards. And not to be standard or assessment focused, but we know that's how we're going to be graded as schools. And what's more important is it's about helping your teachers understand the proficiency of those priority standards. So even if we are not completely, conscious and over anxious about doing well on the assessment, it's a bigger problem of helping teachers really have clarity of what those priority standards look like and sound like. And so today's particular call is talking about how do we help people understand their ELA priority standards, but this process can work with all contents. But at the end of the day, we have to be looking at these assessments because our performance indicators on MSIP 6, how we stay accredited, are going to be aligned to those things as well. But in general, this work helps clarify for teachers what that standard means. So ELA, the standards are tricky. Math is a little bit more objective, but we need to look more of the question content for those grades. And with social studies and science, there's actually huge shifts in how they should be assessing. With social studies, you have a shift to more the tools of inquiry, which is more historical thinking, which relate more to ELA standards. How do I think, read, write like a historian? So when you really study the materials for social studies assessment, it's very similar to a reading assessment and the reading skills. And when you think about science and social studies, both, they used to be more content driven. Now in science, you have the 3-dimensional standards where it's requiring students to look at multiple earth science, physical science, and life science all into one question, where before and how we typically test is over just one domain of science. So there's a lot of shift that is happening that your teachers need to really understand their standards, and starting with assessment helps them to do that. So foundational work before you could even do the steps that I'm proposing today to create high quality assessment is you need to make sure that you have your priority standards placed and paced. So here's an example of a template that our company uses with schools, but just as an anchor, in every unit, your teachers need to be clear what's a priority and what's supporting. And they need to have paced those priorities in a way that they know when it shows up on my pacing guide here, that's when I'm going to create an assessment for them. So I'm giving students multiple times at the same state level rigor to take an assessment over those priority standards. So we have to have this map so we know what priority standards need to be on what unit assessment. And you can start with formative assessments. We tend to recommend starting with unit assessments so we could work the formative backward. But we use our pacing guides to help guide what priority standards need to be on that assessment. On this particular pacing guide, when you see them running all the way across, that means we would be assessing that priority standard on every assessment. So things like context clues, speaking and listening, reading foundational for younger grades, you're going to be doing that every assessment. So here are the steps that I would recommend to you and for your teachers to use when creating assessments. One, identify on their pacing guide what priority standards need to be assessed. Then they need to use state documents to determine the proficiency standard of their priority standard. So these steps will work for any core content. They need to be pulling their item specifications, their MOLEAT blocks, and their map released items. So finding those on the DESE website, I would recommend printing them all off and having them all at the table. Step 3, I would have them review exemplar assessments. One way that we've been disservicing our teachers is we ask them to create things without showing them an exemplar of what it should look like and sounds like, which makes it really hard. So I'm going to walk through this and I'll show you some exemplars that we use with schools, but I would definitely recommend if you have someone in your grade level or in your building who has great assessments, to show them some exemplars of what that could look like and sound like. Then we would recommend having 2 to 3 questions over each priority standard, then creating a scoring guide for each one of those. And then we would recommend having your teachers actually take the assessment and score it together and then make any adjustments needed. So we'll walk through these steps now. Common standard confusion, and this again, we're going to show ELA examples today in this video, but this can work with every core content. If you put a standard in front of teachers like this one for 3rd grade, develop and demonstrate reading skills in response to a text by drawing conclusions and support with textual evidence. Start with a standard like this and ask all of your staff to write a question that they think addresses that standard. And they could find it from a resource. I like to just have them do it from their head. What would you expect a 3rd grade student to, what type of question would you expect them to master? And what's fascinating when you do this activity and then you debrief, what did your question look like? You can guess that it's all over the place. The types of rigor and the types of questioning, it really varies. And so a typical question that teachers come up with, and it may not, this one's actually a little bit stronger. What 2 things did Teddy learn from Nina to become a detective? Because not only is this asking for drawing conclusions, but this particular question is a little bit stronger. It's asking them to multiple select, which can be difficult. But it's very interesting to see how subjective, when we just look at the standard and write a question, just how subjective it could be. And the question I have in front of you is one that would be typical from a resource you use, which is a decent question, but does it really hit the proficiency of what the state would say on the end of the year assessment, what a student should be able to do? And that's really what we're getting at, not what our resource says, not all these different interpretations. We want to calibrate our understanding of proficiency to that of what our state says is proficient for that standard. So how do we do that? Here are these documents that I mentioned. So if you're not familiar where they are, item specifications, MOLEAT blocks, these are newer documents, but they're available for all core contents and map released items. These are all very great resources to be using with teachers to help calibrate. No, this is what proficient assessment questions should look like, sound like. One disclaimer you might notice, especially at K-2, sometimes item specifications and ELA, math, social studies, and science are very weak in those areas. So those may, K-2 is just the weakest at all, right? Because you don't have the MOLEAT blocks yet, you don't have map released items, and sometimes your item specs aren't very good. So our company has something to help you solve that, but I'm just going to state it right now. If you're using state documents, that's a challenge for your K-2 people. And it becomes a burden because you really need them to be vertically aligned. So, but we do the best that can. This is what the state has available that I would suggest to use. So then you anchor people thinking of a typical question and those examples they came up with, then put a state level example in front of them. And this one actually comes from a Molit block. Evaluate source 2 and use your knowledge of social studies to answer the question, what is significant about the location of Missouri's capital city? Now we would need to read the passage to see how difficult this actually is. If it explicitly told us what's significant, I think I remember this question. It actually goes to a map. Think about that. Are teachers ever asking with a visual graphic, or is it always text? This particular one, they have to look back in the text and it's a graph, and they have to draw conclusions about, I believe the answer might be C, where two rivers meet. Again, we'd have to look at the passage so we could remember, but this is a very high level question. And if you think about the typical question that was asked and this one, the rigor is completely different. It's using a graphic, it's asking a lot higher level because of the graphic. These are the types of ahas we want teachers to have. Here's what we typically think a question is, but now we're anchoring ourselves in a state level question, and you need to let them have that cognitive dissonance of what's the content gaps that we would have had, and then what are the assessment gaps that we would have. We didn't use multiple sources in our text, which makes this a higher level question. And we had more explicit right there information to help them make the conclusion. This one did not. They need to have time to observe so it can calibrate for them. What's happening all over the state is teachers are unintentionally teaching below the rigor of the standard. And so the only way to help them understand that they're doing that is for them to look at end of the year proficient. This is what it looks like, sounds like. So give time for those discussions. What did we think our question should be? Now let's look at a sample from the state. What are the differences? And let's note those. And then when we talk about reviewing exemplar assessments, here's an example we use with our schools. It's great to give teachers some autonomy. You've got to hit that middle line where you need to give them enough so they know what parameters and what must-haves need to be on that assessment, but it'll shut some people down if it has to be lockstep in a simple format. So I like to balance that. I think the steps I gave you at the beginning, teachers like specific steps to be able to follow. I think it's very important to lead them through activities like I'm briefly going over with you now to model to them how to think about questions, and then give them, here's an exemplar, and here's what I like about the exemplars that we use. It clearly has what standard is covered in this assessment, the name of the standard, which questions on the assessment align to that standard, and what score. And why this is important is teachers can see at a glance which questions they need to look at for which priority standard, and for standards-based grading purposes, how did they do on that? But these exemplar assessments also should, the ones you choose should also very much mirror what an end of the year assessment question would look like. So, and then also with this particular exemplar, the scoring guide is very robust. We sometimes putter out in asking teachers to create scoring guides, but they're really essential because not only do you need to have the content, but how you score that and how you interpret the right answer is imperative. I have been with a group of second grade teachers. We're all in our 30s and 40s, and we came up with different answers and couldn't come up with the consensus. How do we expect an 8-year-old to do that, right? Or we've noticed, hey, this asked to give 3 details and this passage only has 2. A lot of teachers think it's silly, especially if you're K2, to take the assessment, but it's essential to feel what it feels like as a student to take it, because it will make it a better assessment. And if you have multiple team members on a team, it helps them calibrate. Here's really what we're looking at, so we're on the same page, because it can vary, and how you score can vary the rigor for students. And so last, again, I jumped out of my slide, take the assessment. Once you've shown them some exemplars, they've made 2 to 3 questions for each priority standard, have them actually take the assessment and score it. So how does our company make it easier? I'm going to promo this really quickly. Is we do have our Missouri Assessment and Teaching Tools digitally and hard copy. We find teachers are loving the hard copy more. But I just wanted to show you that not only do we have the proficiency scales for standards-based grading even when teachers unwrap, it's hard for them to get the clarity. So all those great state documents I just told you to pull are on the right side of our scale. So we've got our standard, what a level 4 would be. Here's an example of a level 4 question. Here's a level 3. Here's all the item specs and level questions for a level 3. So I just want to tell you how we do this process. That's a little bit faster. You could look at a typical question, then teachers could look at their map book. What do the item specs say? Here's that sample question. It's all right for them. So rather than pulling all those millions of documents, they could just look at one spot to see, how do my item specs ask it? What does my source say? And then here are the key takeaways that we have when we're working with teachers to be very explicit on helping them discern that. And then we have a list when you work with our company of lots of sample assessments, like we showed on the slides, that we can provide to teachers to help get them started. We do need to scaffold for newer teachers to give them a bank of high quality things. But we always push, we're trying to find the balance when to have teachers do the work and when not to. We believe assessment creation is important because it helps you grapple with the complexity of the standard. So if you have our product, our steps look a little bit different because you can identify that priority standard and then you can just use the tool to consume all those documents we talked about. And then we also have samples. So what's next for your district, depending on where you're at in that continuum with any core content, we would definitely recommend using the state documents that I referenced on this call, giving your teachers a process. For social studies and science, you can use those MOLEAP blocks as your exemplars and be very confident that if they are asking those types of questions, that they're setting their students up for success. I apologize, I blew through that. So if there's anyone on the call who has questions, I would be happy to answer them. I'll pause the video here.